The day cometh to finally escape the plantation and become free. The dream Mr. Frederick Douglass has had since a child is about to manifest. He and his crew have been properly preparing themselves, at least as best as they could, to come face to face with the unknown. It's either do or die, now or never for the group, as they take one of the biggest risks that could be taken in the South at that time. In his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Mr. Douglass tells us that on the day of escape, our anxiety grew more and more intense as the time of our intended departure for the North drew nigh. It was truly felt to be a matter of life and death with us, and we fully intended to fight as well as run, if necessity should occur for that extremity. But the trial hour was not yet to come. It was easy to resolve, but not so easy to act. I expected there might be some drawing back at the last. It was natural that there should be. Therefore, during the intervening time, I lost no opportunity to explain away difficulties, to remove doubts, to dispel fears, and to inspire all with firmness. It was too late to look back, and now was the time to go forward. He did what he was supposed to do as a leader. Everyone's mind had to be in the right place to pull this off. Like most other men, we had done the talking part of our work long and well, and the time had come to act as if we were in earnest, and meant to be as true in action as in words. I did not forget to appeal to the pride of my comrades by telling them that, if after having solemnly promised to go, as they had done, they now failed to make the attempt, they would, in effect, brand themselves with cowardice and might as well sit down, fold their arms, and acknowledge themselves as fit only to be slaves. That's right. If you don't believe in freedom enough to take the risk, then sit your behind down and stay a slave. If you don't want to go for it, then don't go for it. It's really that simple, right? And he's got to be this way because you don't want to string people along on these types of missions who don't have a strong desire to do it, because in the end, they're going to become a liability to the group, and they're going to increase the risk of people getting caught or killed, right? So they have to be left behind where they want to be the most, in slavery, and that goes for physical and mental slavery. This detestable character all were unwilling to assume. Every man except Sandy, he, much to our regret, withdrew, stood firm. Sandy dropped out, right? It wasn't for him. They wanted him to come, but he did not want to come enough for whatever reason. But the other men stood firm. And at our last meeting, we pledged ourselves afresh, and in the most solemn manner, that, at the time appointed, we would certainly start on our long journey for a free country. That's the promise they made to themselves. So, as they prepared to run, they began work as usual that morning. Now, obviously, during their work, they were all anxious and nervous, doing the typical things, right? Their conscious mind was flooded with all sorts of images, questions, and concerns. The inner chatter must have been nonstop that day for them. He says, "While thus engaged, I had a sudden presentiment, which flashed upon me like lightning in a dark night, revealing to the lonely traveler the gulf before and the enemy behind. I instantly turned to Sandy Jenkins, who was near me, and said to him, 'Sandy, we are betrayed. Something has just told me so.' Uh-oh, his intuitions were alerting. The word of the Lord came to him saying, 'We are betrayed.' I felt as sure of it as if the officers were there in sight. Sandy said,
'Man, that is strange, but I feel just as you do.'
If my mother, then long in her grave, had appeared before me and told me that we were betrayed, I could not at that moment have felt more certain of the fact. After this hunch, the horn blew, which called the slaves from the field in for breakfast. And walking toward the house, his anxiety was through the roof, and he felt like a person who was headed to be executed for some great offense. He couldn't eat, and he felt as though something just wasn't right? Now, inside the house, he kept his eye on this gate, which was about a half-mile distance away from the house. It's the main gate. But it was concealed because it was surrounded by a lot of trees. He says, I was, however, able to descry 4 white men and 2 colored men approaching. What were they doing? The white men were on horseback, and the colored men were walking behind and seemed to be tied. It is all over with us, thought I. We are surely betrayed. He thinks someone spoiled the plan and the men are coming to take him.
I now became composed, or at least comparatively so, and calmly awaited the result. I watched the ill-omened company till I saw them enter the gate. Successful flight was impossible, and I made up my mind to stand and meet the evil, whatever it might be. For I was not without a slight hope that things might turn differently from what I at first expected. In a few moments in came Mr. William Hamilton, riding very rapidly and evidently much excited. He was in the habit of riding very slowly and was seldom known to gallop his horse. This time his horse was nearly at full speed, causing the dust to roll thick behind him. Mr. Hamilton, though one of the most resolute men in the whole neighborhood, was, nevertheless, a remarkably mild-spoken man, and, even when greatly excited, his language was cool and circumspect. He came to the door and inquired if Mr. Freeland was in. I told him that Mr. Freeland was at the barn. Off the old gentleman rode toward the barn with unwonted speed. Mary, the cook, was at a loss to know what was the matter, and I did not profess any skill in making her understand. I knew she would have united as readily as anyone in cursing me for bringing trouble into the family, so I held my peace, leaving matters to develop themselves without my assistance.
Here we go.
In a few moments, Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Freeland came down from the barn to the house, and just as they made their appearance in the front yard, 3 men, who proved to be constables, came dashing into the lane, on horseback, as if summoned by a sign requiring quick work.
Law enforcement is in town, and they're riding around like they're on a real mission.
A few seconds brought them into the front yard, where they hastily dismounted and tied their horses. This done, they joined Mr. Freeland and Mr. Hamilton, who were standing a short distance from the kitchen. I stepped toward them, at the door, and asked what they wanted, when the constables grabbed me and told me that I had better not resist.
Oh, snaps! Why did they grab him?
That I had been in a scrape, or was said to have been in one. That they were merely going to take me where I could be examined. That they were going to carry me to St. Michael's, to have me brought before my master.
Who was his master at the time? It was still Thomas Auld. He was hired to work for Mr. Freeland, but he was still owned by Thomas Auld. They wanted to bring him before that master of his. What else did they say?
They further said that in case the evidence against me was not true, I should be acquitted.
At this point, they were vague and not very specific about what the trouble was, but they would let him loose if there was not enough evidence against him.
I was now firmly tied and completely at the mercy of my captors. Resistance was idle. They were 5 in number, armed to the very teeth. When they had secured me, they next turned to John Harris and, in a few moments, succeeded in tying him as firmly as they had already tied me.
Uh-oh, they wanted John too. Who was John? Another member in the escape plan.
They next turned toward Henry Harris, who had now returned from the barn.
Who was another member in the plan. They turned towards Henry and said,
"Cross your hands,"
said the constables to Henry.
"I won't,"
said Henry, in a voice so firm and clear, and in a manner so determined, as for a moment to arrest all proceedings.
"Won't you cross your hands?"
said Tom Graham, the constable.
"No, I won't,"
said Henry, with increasing emphasis.
Henry wasn't having it. He was firmly sold on freedom and was ready to resist at all cost.
Mr. Hamilton, Mr. Freeland, and the officers now came near to Henry. 2 of the constables drew out their shining pistols and swore by the name of God that he should cross his hands or they would shoot him down.
Would they have shot? You better believe they would have. Henry knew it, and how did he respond?
Shoot me,"
said Henry.
"You can't kill me but once. Shoot, and be damned, I won't be tied."
He was ready to go out.
"This," the brave fellow said in a voice as defiant and heroic in its tone as was the language itself, and, at the moment of saying this, with the pistols at his very breast, he quickly raised his arms and dashed them from the puny hands of his assassins, the weapons flying in opposite directions. Now came the struggle. All hands was now rushed upon the brave fellow, and after beating him for some time, they succeeded in overpowering and tying him.
Dang, they finally got him, but not after a good tussle. He didn't give in, and he stood his ground even while possibly facing death. Mr. Douglass says,
Henry put me to shame. He fought, and fought bravely. John and I had made no resistance. The fact is, I never see much use in fighting unless there is a reasonable probability of whipping somebody. Yet there was something almost providential in the resistance made by the gallant Henry. But for that resistance, every soul of us would have been hurried off to the far south,
where they pick cotton and work outside all day in the hot sun. If a person was sold to the deep south, Alabama, Louisiana, they could almost forget about escaping to freedom. It's way too far south and it has way too many obstacles to endure. It's still possible, but it's much more risky than being in a state like Maryland. On top of that, the people were also more brutal and vicious in the deep south, being further away from any northern influence. They could get away with a lot more savage practices down there, right? So the resistance Henry put in is what get Negroes shipped right on down to that area to suffer.
Just a moment previous to the trouble with Henry, Mr. Hamilton mildly said, and this gave me the unmistakable clue to the cause of our arrest.
Perhaps we had now better make a search for those protections, which we understand Frederick has written for himself and the rest.
Those are the papers Mr. Douglass forged to get them permission to be in Baltimore. We remember that, right? The only reason Mr. Hamilton knew about those papers is because somebody must have told.
Had these passes been found, they would have been point-blank proof against us and would have confirmed all the statements of our betrayer. Just as we were all completely tied and about ready to start towards St. Michael's and thence to jail, Mrs. Betsy Freeland, mother to William, who was very much attached after the Southern fashion to Henry and John, they having been reared from childhood in her house, came to the kitchen door with her hands full of biscuits, for we had not had time to take our breakfast that morning, and divided them between Henry and John. This done, the lady made the following parting address to me, looking and pointing her bony finger at me.
You devil, you yellow devil! It was you that put it into the heads of Henry and John to run away. But for you, you long-legged yellow devil, Henry and John would never have thought of running away.
You hear that? He is the devil for inspiring them to gain their freedom. Think about that. That's what I want you to do. Because when you begin to observe closely, many ways in which the world works become apparent. And what was once a mystery becomes super obvious, right? Now, what happened to Mr. Douglass, John, and Henry after they were tied? We're going to find out as we continue, right? So I thank you for watching right now until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.